Hello, welcome to another episode of History Hack. Alex, who have we got on today?
I have decided that we all need to learn something today, you included, and me. So I invited Ted Hooton to join us. Ted has been a journalist for 40 years, specialises in defence. He's written numerous articles on military history. He's also written books on the Luftwaffe, on Russian air power, on World War I air power. But we've got him here today to talk about a book he wrote that covers the Balkan Wars. So we all know we have to list this as a cause of World War I. And then I am just as guilty as everyone else in knowing that I know when it happened, but that's it. I know nothing else. So Ted, welcome.
Thank you.
It's going to be really good to learn about this properly. Okay, so I suppose, first of all, we need to set the scene, don't we? So can you tell us the story behind the phrase, the sick man of Europe, and why does it make this region so volatile?
Well, the sick man of Europe, was first used by Tsar Nicholas I in 1853. The term sick man of Europe actually was written in the New York Times in March 1861. And what it meant was that you have the Ottoman Empire slowly but surely declining, and you have, especially in Europe, the rise of young, dynamic powers driven by nationalism and with territorial ambitions. And those territorial ambitions were focused upon the Ottoman Empire. If you like, it was rather like scavengers trying to hunt down an old buffalo. And the Ottoman Empire, although nominally strong, was in fact very, very rickety. But then so was the Austro-Hungarian Empire on its northern borders.
Yeah, it's just, and this is why, isn't it? Because this is where they clash in the Balkans.
Yes.
And this is why the region is volatile.
Indeed it is. And it's these territorial ambitions. Basically what happens is that the Greeks, the Bulgarians and the Serbians, together with the Montenegrins, form an alliance, an agreement, basically to try and knock bits off the Ottoman Empire, with the hopes that the great powers, Russia, Austro-Hungary, and to a lesser degree Great Britain, will go along with this. And one reason or another, they get together and they trigger the war.
So can you draw the battle lines for us? And who are the major players in this story?
It's not so much personalities. The personalities tend to be forgotten, but a curious thing is that monarchs play an interesting part in this. Ferdinand I, the Emperor of Bulgaria, and he is the man who is manipulating the Bulgarian scene. His generals are people like Vasily Kutinichov, Nikolai Ivanov, and especially Radko Dimitrov. On the Serbian side, you have Radomir Putnik. On the Greek side, Prince Constantine. On the Montenegrin side, Crown Prince Danilo. And the Turkish leader with the greatest influence was Nazim Pasha. These are the people who are the prime players, but there are numerous others. It's one of the most extremely complex struggles, which it's almost as difficult to describe as one of the First World War, the Second World War. Numerous fronts, masses of diplomatic shenanigans, and it becomes sometimes quite bewildering.
It's mad, isn't it? So you've got kind of the Austro-Hungarians trying to maintain their imperial integrity, and the Ottomans, and then all of these nationalist entities as well mixed in, trying to break away.
Yeah, and you have the Russians determined to use especially the Bulgarians, as a sort of a proxy means of gaining access to the Mediterranean.
I think so. There's a lot of names in there that you've just read out that are in World War I as well. It's quite extraordinary then how they were possibly the only people that took part in World War I that had such a recent battle experience.
But there's one other which I haven't mentioned, and that is Kemal Ataturk, who actually fought in Gallipoli between 1912 and 1913.
And that is, of course, the founder of the Republic
The founder
of
modern Turkey, and incidentally, the man who destroyed the Greek, who destroyed the Greek presence, post-war Greek presence in Asia Minor, and that presence was deployed by King Constantine, who had been Crown Prince of Constantine in the Balkan Wars.
He's one of the ones to lose his throne as well, isn't he?
I think he was the one who died through a monkey bite.
No, that was his son, I think,
That's
Alexander.
his son,
it's my favourite entry in George V's diary ever. It just says, King Alexander died, he was bit by a monkey. That's it. And you're like, what? Where did that come from? It's just in the middle of all the usual drudgery around Buckingham Palace. I love it. So it's been a while since there's been armed conflict in Europe, isn't it? So what kind of technological advancements do we see in the Balkans Wars, and how do they act as a trial run of sorts for World War I?
Well, the first thing is that the Balkan Wars, not the Russo-Japanese War, which most people focus on, the Balkan Wars are the watershed between 19th and 20th century warfare. You actually have in the Balkans the last use of gunpowder in small arms and to a lesser degree cannon. You also have the use of the new quick-fire, very accurate artillery with recuperator mechanisms, which means they use nitrocellulose propellants and explosives. They're more accurate, have longer ranges, and more importantly, you fire them, they're still in place. You don't have to push them back into place to aim them. In addition, you have the development of automatic weapons, and in addition to that, you have the greater use of heavy artillery. That was the one thing that influenced all the powers at the end of it. They all realized suddenly, in the case of the French, that you needed heavy artillery as well as field guns on the battlefield, especially if you're using them against entrenched defenders. So that is why it is extremely important. It is, if you like, artillery becomes the dominating factor on the battlefield for the first time, which is what happened, of course, in the First World War. First World War was an artilleryman's war from day one to day zero.
So in the First World War, we're about to see complete confusion because people don't know how to implement advancements in warfare. Do we see that here too?
In a way, yes, you do. You see, the problem is that between about 1870 and 1914, you get a colossal developments in technology of all sorts and all shapes and sizes, especially military. And you have the development from gunpowder-based warfare to nitrocellulose-based warfare, which means more accurate, longer-ranged weapons, also smokeless. And the problem was that the armies of the time had great difficulty adjusting to this. You still have troops going into battle in 1914, in the Balkan Wars and in 1914, going into battle almost shoulder to shoulder behind the banners, just as they had done in Napoleonic times. And it was difficult for the armies to grasp the impact of the technology upon the battlefield. It took them, really, it wasn't until about 1916, 1917 that the generals began to understand this. But you do find, for example, in the German counterattack at Cambrai in November 1917, one of the reasons it wasn't as successful as you might think was because the German troops were going into battle almost shoulder to shoulder. Heaven only knows what idiot decided that would happen, but there we go. They were cut to pieces, sometimes incidentally by American railroad troops, but they were cut to pieces by the defenders, and that was why they didn't regain all the territory which was won by the tanks. So you do have this tremendous confusion, and the need to begin to adjust to the new technology, to the new forms of warfare.
So in terms of the actual fighting in the Balkan
Yes.
Wars, tell us, how does it break out?
It breaks out because the various nations are deciding to push and push and push until finally the Ottomans find themselves facing war. It's as simple as that. And you have basically two theatres, the Eastern Theatre, which is roughly around Thrace, and the Western Theatre, which is basically Macedonia, but it's also roughly modern Albania. So you have these, and you have various armies fighting almost private wars within them.
So let's start with the Eastern Theatre. You call this the Hollow Triumph.
Yeah. It's the Hollow Triumph because it was largely, especially in the eastern part, it was a triumph of Bulgarian arms. They basically drove the Ottoman Empire almost to the gates of Constantinople. It was a tremendous success, and it was in the Second Balkan Wars. It was a total failure. Everything that they had won, almost everything they'd won, they'd lost. Hence, it was a hollow triumph. They also tried to go for Macedonia, especially for Salonika. They got a presence into Salonika, but that was pushed out in the Second Balkan War. And basically, everything, the Bulgarians had hoped to have a greater Bulgaria, about twice the size of modern Bulgaria. And at one point they achieved this, but both diplomatically and militarily, they lost out because the British and the Germans were not happy about anything which strengthened Russian power, even indirectly. The Bulgarians were closely associated with the Russians. And this was one of the problems. The Greeks, the Serbians, they all got territory, and in Macedonia, and on the other side, in the Western Theatre, there were the Montenegrins, the Serbians, the Greeks. They all got territory. The Bulgarians, who'd really done most of the fighting, who'd been the spearhead of the Allied forces against the Ottoman Empire, had done it for absolutely nothing. They'd suffered terrible casualties in the process. Hence, it was a very hollow triumph.
What about the Western Front? So you have called this the ebb and flow of ambition in the book.
Oh, yes. Well, again, you have here the Serbs, Greeks, Montenegrins, Bulgarians. They've all got territorial ambitions in this area. As I said, the Bulgarians wanted parts of Macedonia. They especially wanted Salonika, which was the great port for the region. The Serbs wanted what is modern southern southern Serbia. In my young day, it was modern southern Yugoslavia. The Montenegrins wanted chunks of modern Albania. There was Albanians as well. And the Serbs wanted territory. The Greeks wanted territory on the western coast. Everybody wanted territory, and they got some of it. But in the Treaty of London in 1930, which was signed in 1913, they often had to concede, often because of great power pressure. And hence the ebb and flow. They often would get ground, and then they'd be forced to concede parts of it because of great power pressure.
Can you tell us more as well about naval warfare in the Balkan Wars?
Naval warfare was basically between the Greeks and the Turks, and it was the last of the pre-Dreadnought wars. The Greeks were far more aggressive, and although the Turkish navy was stronger in terms of ships, the Greeks kept it off balance all the time. Two interesting factors it also involved, and that is that the first use of a submarine in European naval warfare, it fired a torpedo at a battleship, missed, dropped its ballast and promptly rose to the surface and was out of action. There was also an air attack. one other interesting thing, not directly part of the Balkan War, but part of a separate war between Italy and the Ottoman Empire, was that the Italian Navy attempted to force their way into the Bosphorus through the straits of past the Dardanelles. In other words, you have something that happened only 3 years later. This was in 1912. 1915, the Allies are trying exactly the same thing. Oh, and also both efforts failed. Most people aren't aware of this Italian effort. In fact, I attended a lecture in a ship, the Marco Polo, which is going to be scrapped, and it was about the Dardanelles. And the lecturer hadn't been aware of this Italian naval effort.
To my shame, I'm not either.
Hardly anybody does. When the Italians took Libya, this was part of the military operations. Exactly why they went into the Bosphorus, to be honest, I don't know, because it's not part of something I've really studied.
I think, isn't the Italians over Libya is the first time someone drops a bomb out of an aeroplane as well?
It's probably the same time, although there were similar efforts during the Balkan Wars. And during the Balkan Wars, you also have what we now call electronic warfare. You have communications intelligence, which is listening into enemy radio messages. You also have what we call electronic countermeasures, ECM, which was trying to jam such radio messages.
You've mentioned diplomacy playing a huge part in the Balkan Wars. Why is that?
Well, the whole period between 1880 and 1914, Europe is simmering away. You have the great groups of alliances, each one of them determined, feeling itself threatened. And now you have a total change in the balance of power in the Balkans, an area which is notorious for its volatility. So you have the Greeks seizing most of the islands off the Turkish Anatolian coast. You have the Greeks basically doubling the size of their country. You have the Serbians growing in power. You have the Bulgarians growing in power. All of this threatened the whole of the European balance of power, and the European superpowers were extremely concerned about it. You see, up to about that period, what had kept them all in check was the developments in military technology. You have changes between almost every decade, between 1880 and certainly 1890. One way you can look at this is, I mentioned recuperators. These are things that like tubes on the bottom or below a gun barrel. And in 1896, the German army introduced its FK-96 field gun, which did not have recuperators. They were really proud. These were the new Krupp guns, accurate, the new nitrocellulose explosives, propellants, fantastic. And the French introduced the model 1897, which had recuperators and basically was more accurate, faster firing than the German guns. So that meant that the Germans had to totally modernize the new field guns. And things like that, you got the uncertainty over whether military technology, the other side might have some superior military technology, made the generals and the admirals reluctant to rattle their sabres too loudly. There was sabre rattling, yes, but nobody wanted to actually start swinging at each other until around by the first decade of the 20th century. You have the situation where the technology has stabilized. The armies are re-equipping with that technology, artillery with recuperators, machine guns, magazine rifles, this sort of thing. You've got the aeroplane, the airship, and the the military side is more confident, so that when in the past, if the diplomats had suggested real military action, the generals had held them back. Now they no longer held them back. This is especially true of Austria-Hungary, where you get the generals, and especially as a result of this of the diplomatic actions in the Balkan Wars, both after the two Balkan Wars, you have a situation where the threat is so great, perceived as so great by the Austrian armed forces, the Austrian army, that they are gung-ho for attacking Serbia on any pretext, which of course triggers World War I. But it's this uncertainty which holds back the generals, the diplomats from war. That's why it's so important, why each side was willing to carry out diplomatic, willing to resort more to diplomatic rather than military action. That's why this is so important diplomatically. It's the last time, because everybody thought in the summer of 1914 it would be another crisis like they'd had dozens before, only it didn't.
Because it's the quote from Gray, isn't there, about if there was a European war, it would come out of some damn business in the Balkans. So people recognised it, but it was just the the time they didn't breach the problem diplomatically, isn't it?
Precisely. They couldn't find a solution, because basically Austria was willing to use military means. Germany was willing to back her up. Russia was willing to use military means to support the Serbs, and the French were linked into the Russians. So it was like sort of turning turning a fuse and then firing the gun. Bang.
Bang indeed. So let's just get the distinction right, because there are two Balkan Wars with plural, because it stops and then it starts again. Can you explain that to people?
Yes, basically the Treaty of London, not everybody was happy, and especially the Bulgarians. The Serbs and the Greeks, they weren't happy either, and basically they decided to gang up against the Bulgarians and attack them in order to secure their position, especially in Macedonia. And the Bulgarians were weakened, but they decided to stage an offensive, which was initially successful, but then held back. The Greeks and the Serbians then began pushing into Bulgaria, and just to join in the fun, the Romanians decided they had territorial ambitions in what was then Greater Bulgaria, so they joined the conflict, and basically Bulgaria was being pushed in, was like a fist sticking out and somebody swinging an axe on it. And in the meantime, as they began to fall back, as their defeat became obvious, the Turks decided, right, this is the time to get our own back, and they regained what was called at the time Adrianople, which is now called, I think, Erdeni. I think that's the modern name for it, but it was called at that time Adrianople. And they basically regained a chunk of their European empire. And it left the Bulgarians, they gained a little bit of territory, but all the territory they'd won was lost. And they were pretty hacked off. In fact, after the Treaty of Constantinople, they started looking towards Germany and Turkey as new allies. They weren't interested in the Russians at all.
I'm going to be really mean now because I didn't give you this question in advance, but I'd really like to know. So Bulgaria don't declare war in 1914. It takes till the end of 1915 for them to come into the conflict. So why is that if they're so hacked off with what happens in the Balkan Wars?
Because they didn't want to play hopscotch in the minefield. Because they couldn't be certain what the heck was happening. And also they'd taken terrible losses in both men and material, and they needed time to rebuild it. And only when they were in a position to they were strong enough to start the war. Also, you have the situation where the Germans and Austrians are able to keep the Romanians off their backs, and the Serbians themselves had suffered a terrible defeat, basically almost being driven out of Serbia into Albania. So this was the time, we're on the winning side, guys. Let's join in the battle.
Yeah, it's not worth the effort for them beforehand, is it?
No, not at all, not at all. And then you have a situation where the Allies decide to come to the aid of the Greeks. Though the Greek king was he was pro-German, and he was basically deposed. Venizelos? Sorry.
That's right, yeah, it is.
Venizelos.
Yep.
He becomes the prime minister, basically sanctifies the presence of the French and the Germans, sorry, the French and the British, Germans. And this leads to 2 years of almost totally static warfare, a total waste of time. In fact, the garrison were referred to as this Gardeners of Salonika. But in September 1918, the Allies then made this great sweep, which allows the Serbs to regain the whole of their territory, regain some more Bulgarian territory, and basically Bulgaria is once again almost emasculated.
And Ferdinand is another one that loses his throne, isn't he?
Oh no, Ferdinand keeps his throne.
Does he keep his throne? I thought he was.
And his son, I think he kept his throne till 1943.
Ah, I did not know that. I think for me, he will always be immortalised as the one that had his bottom spanked by Kaiser Wilhelm in public.
It's good to know we can have fun in royal circles.
This is true. I have to ask you, what do you think is the most important development or most important sort of trial of something in battle in the Balkan Wars that we then see in the First World War?
I think it's the siege of Katakala, the defences, because there you have a situation where the very weak forces fall back onto defences which are hastily rebuilt, and they hold back the whole of the Bulgarian army, and basically, as I said, kept the Bulgarians out of Constantinople. There were quite a few battles which showed the way that the things were going, but that particular siege, the Katalka lines, that was a decisive moment, because it demonstrated the power of the defence, no matter what. And it also saved Constantinople.
Is there any lesson you think should have been learnt from the Balkan Wars that isn't?
No, because there was no real time to learn the lessons. After the Russo-Japanese War, you've got certainly the Germans, certainly the British, and I presume the French and the Russians, all had official histories out. They had time to examine, to look at it, and to make adjustments in their forces. The Balkan Wars happened within about a year of the Balkan Wars ending. The First World War breaks out. There is no time. The French begin to place orders for 155mm howitzers and cannon. In other words, heavy artillery. But it's at least 2 years before they begin to appear, and they are really hunting around for heavy artillery for their offensives, which are all get chopped to pieces.
And I'm translating an account actually by a French artilleryman with a 155 in Gallipoli, and I think it's ancient.
Oh yeah. I mean, in the Gallipoli battles, you have a French officer who loses one arm, and he's the officer who turns up on the flank of the Americans during the Argonne offensive. It's one of these little things. The Americans they mention he's one arm, but they never mention where he lost his arm, which was at Gallipoli.
I want to ask you, just lastly, before we finish, this has been great as a crash course in the Balkan War.
I hope so.
Yeah. I want to ask, everybody who's ever had to write that essay about the causes of the First World War knows they have to mention the Balkan Wars, but how important are they in the historiography of the 20th century?
I think they are a key event. Because they create the uncertainty, the diplomatic uncertainty. They shake the whole of the diplomatic chessboard, and they create a totally new situation, which increases the tensions between certainly Russia and Austria-Hungary. The two had come almost to war in 1912, 1913, but wiser heads held people back. This time, there was nothing to hold them back, especially with the Germans backing the Russians, backing the Austrians.
It's definitely a significant stepping stone,
without doubt. You might well, if it hadn't been for the Balkan Wars, there's a chance that the situation that existed, say, roughly in 1900, would have continued certainly into the 1920s. You never know. But that was once the whole of the chessboard had been changed, it made a whole new situation. You also have a situation where the armed forces are now confident that they have the other side will not have brand new technologies, which will mean that their forces are outdated. They're therefore confident of being able to meet the enemy in battle. So it becomes a perfect storm. Diplomatic uncertainty, military certainty, and you're just waiting for somebody to toss a match into the barrel of gunpowder. And a very lucky assassin with a Browning pistol manages to do that. It's Sarajevo.
Ted, thank you so much for joining us. I learned so much at this point.
I hope so.
I didn't really know that much about this. Actually, I knew nothing. I knew zero. And now I have a wider knowledge. So thank you so much for joining.
That's all right. Thank you for asking me.
Don't forget that we do exist on Patreon as History Hack and on Patreon as well, which is Podbean's own version. Alina and I have had massive fun doing this in 2020, but life's going to change quite a lot next year and we're going to actually have to go and earn a living, etc. If we want to keep up the regularity that we've been bringing you and the kind of guests that we've been bringing you and the workload, then we will need your help. So if you join, there's going to be incentives for joining on either of those platforms. We're revamping ourselves on both of them. So don't forget to go in. You can do as little as $1 a month and it all goes towards keeping up History Hack as regular as we've been able to bring it to you this year. We are now on YouTube. We are posting all of our new episodes on there and we have our own channel and we are gradually posting all of the back episodes because we have been made aware of the fact that you can only find the last 100 on some platforms. So you can go and listen to your heart's content and laugh at the cartoons and have a great time. So do go over there and subscribe.